Welcome to the Waking Up Podcast. This is Sam Harris. Today I'll be speaking with Megan Phelps Roper, who is the granddaughter of the infamous Fred Phelps, who is the pastor of the infamous Westboro Baptist Church. You've seen the signs they hold while picketing the funerals of dead soldiers. Signs that read, "God hates fags," or "Thank God for dead soldiers," or "Thank God for AIDS." Megan grew up in this church, as did the rest of her family. Most of her family remains in it. She has since left and is in a unique position to bear witness to the power of religious belief, both in her own life and in the lives of everyone she grew up with. I found it a fascinating conversation. I found her a highly intelligent and seemingly very reliable witness to this sort of life experience, and I hope you find our conversation as enjoyable as I did. One thing I should point out is that it will seem highly anachronistic that we don't talk about the recent Supreme Court ruling that made it legal for gays and lesbians to marry throughout the United States. We actually spoke before that ruling came down. Also, I feel the need to apologize for the quality of the audio. The more I get into podcasting, the more I am horrified by the quality of the audio I've put out previously, but I assure you eventually things will be stable on my end. Unfortunately, this was not such an occasion. I would fire my audio engineer, but then I would have to fire myself. And now I give you Megan Phelps Roper. Hey Megan, how you doing?
I'm really good. How are you?
I'm good. Well, thank you for doing this. It's great to hear your voice. And you and I were put in touch by Graham Wood, the Atlantic writer. And how did you cross paths with him? And did he interview you for something previously? Or
yeah, so I was on Twitter, and his cover story, "What ISIS Really Wants," was in my feed a lot, and I read it. And as I was reading it, I was hearing so many themes that were so similar to my own upbringing. I mean, obviously, my family, Westboro Baptist Church, is not ISIS, but there's so many aspects of the way they believe and things that just struck me as I was going through it. And when I got to the end of the article, I was just totally blown away. And I scrolled back to the top and I saw his name and I immediately recognized it. And about 8 years ago, I was talking to him we were talking about soldiers' funerals. It was when, not that long after the soldiers' funerals protests had started at the church. And we exchanged emails back then. And so I, found him on Twitter and I was like, "Hey, I don't know if you remember me, but I just read your article and it was amazing." And then we just started talking.
Yeah. What Graham thought would be interesting in putting the two of us together is to talk about the power of religious belief and the role that it plays in inspiring people's behavior. And you obviously have a unique perspective on that, having the background that you have. But let's back up and talk about your background itself and what the Westboro Baptist Church is. Many people will have seen the visuals online of you and the rest of the of your family, I guess, holding signs that say "God hates fags," or I think "Thank God for dead soldiers" is one of them. So to tell me about Westboro, and let's get into what you actually believed growing up.
Right. Okay. So the protesting started when I was 5, and the church is located about half a mile from a public park in Topeka, Kansas. And this park was known as a place where gays could go and meet and have anonymous sex. And it was something that was well known in the community, and it was even listed in this nationally circulated address book of such places, listings across the country. And one day, a couple of years before the picketing started, my grandfather was riding through the park with my older brother, who was at the time about 4 or 5, maybe. They were riding their bikes, and my grandfather would ride ahead a little way and then circle back. And one of the times when he was circling back, he saw 2 men, trying to lure my brother into the bushes, and just immediately wanted to do something about it. So he started writing letters to the city fathers and going to city council meetings, trying to get, the park cleaned up. it was really something that was well known. There were, journalists and cops, they were doing sting operations. And so it was an undeniable fact.
So this was in what year?
88, 89.
And this was your father or your grandfather who had this experience?
My grandfather. Okay. Yes, my grandfather is Fred Phelps, sorry. Right. And he's the one who who was the first pastor of the Westboro Baptist Church.
Was he a pastor already, or he just decided to become one at this point?
So he was ordained when he was, I think, 16 or 17 in Utah, and he was kind of a traveling preacher. And then he ended up in Topeka, and he was preaching at a church called the Eastside Baptist Church, and they were about to start another church on the other side of town, and they asked him to stay and be the pastor. So that's how he ended up in Topeka at this church.
So he had this experience of which would spark homophobia in many predisposed to it, and so he decided to start this church. What was he already someone? He had to have already been someone who was quite fundamentalist in his belief anyway, right? Or was this a formative moment for him?
So I'm sorry, I should back up a little ways. So the church actually started in 1955. So he had been a preacher for some time before this incident. I'm sorry, I think I misunderstood what you were saying. Sure. So he and his views over the years had gotten further and further away from the mainstream. And so when this happened, and he spent, I think it was about a year, maybe more than a year, trying to get the city to do something about it. And when he eventually got thrown out of a city council meeting for saying that the city council members were sitting around like last year's Christmas trees. And so they threw him out, and he said, okay, well, I'm going to do something about this myself. So that's when the picketing actually started. And it was just relatively innocuous signs like, watch your kids, gays troll this park, gays are in the restrooms, and, things like that. And the response, from the community, other churches started coming out to counter protests, saying things like God's love speaks loudest. There was a huge contingent of protesters counter protesters from KU, which is about half an hour away from the church. And so and it started. There wasn't much about God initially, but then when these churches started to counter protest, they were like, well, the Bible does say things about gays, and it's not good, and we are a church, and we have to address this issue. So that's how it initially got started. And then over the years, it just got more and more extreme. So first, gays were the target. And then it was churches for supporting gays and otherwise, not following what my grandfather and the church members believed. They weren't following what the Bible said, not just about gays, but about, premarital sex and divorce and remarriage and adultery. And, and then pretty quickly, the funeral protesting started. I think it was 93. So this was all in 91 is actually when the protesting started. So I think 93, they were protesting funerals of gay people who had died of AIDS. And it was partly an attention-getting mechanism, but it was never just to get attention. I remember, and this is something that a lot of people, have charged the church with. Yes, they're not really Christian. They don't really follow the Bible. Here, look, they ignore this verse and this verse, but there was. I remember listening to my grandfather in an interview a few years ago, and the reporter said, "Some people say that you're just doing these things to get attention," and he kind of looked at her like she was crazy or stupid, and said, well, of course I'm doing it to get attention. How can I preach to these people if I don't have their attention? So there was always a reason and a purpose for the protests themselves. But to get attention for them and to get attention for the message was always the primary goal.
The charge that things are done just to get attention usually carries with it the insinuation that people don't really believe what they say they believe, that these expressions of hatred are just meant to be inflammatory, but aren't necessarily an honest statement of one's outlook. Was there any distance between what you and the rest of the family believed and what you were saying publicly, or were you just simply giving voice to your actual worldview?
No, we were just giving voice to our actual worldview. I mean, my family didn't come to the table with hatred for LGBT people, and then look to the Bible to justify that hatred, which is a common charge. They read, "If a man also lie with mankind as he lieth with a woman, both of them have committed abomination. They shall surely be put to death. Their blood shall be upon them." And walked away from that with, and not just that verse, but lots of other ones. They walked away from that with, "God hates fags," and right, supporting the death penalty for gays. And to categorically deny a connection between those words from Leviticus and our beliefs, to say that we read into the text what we wanted to see, is I think, to be blind to the nearly all-encompassing power of that sort of blinding faith. And it's that's why it was such almost a relief to read in Graham Wood's article to say that ISIS is Islamic, very Islamic. It's not a matter of ISIS being representative of Muslims as a whole. It's a matter of them drawing inspiration from the text.
Yeah. And the church and your grandfather are sometimes mentioned in this connection. So what I find as someone who criticizes the link between religious belief, in this case Muslim jihadist ideas, and a phenomenon like ISIS, I find that people who don't like that connection very much will say, well, we have our extremists, we have the Westboro Baptist Church. Now, it's always a frustrating thing to hear, as though what your family has done is in any way analogous to what is happening throughout much of the Muslim world, and in particular in Syria and Iraq right now. But your family's church is often held out as the most extreme variant of Christianity in the West, and in particular in the U.S. I'm wondering if that's true. I actually don't. I'd like to just find out precisely what you believed on other topics, but it's clear that this attention-getting mechanism of standing out there with signs has convinced many people that you're extreme. But are you part of the Reconstructionist or Dominionist movement that wants all of the old laws in Leviticus and Deuteronomy practiced? I mean, do you think that homosexuals should be killed or adulterers should be killed? Because there are Christians in the U.S. who claim to believe that, and is your grandfather among them?
Yes. Okay. They're not trying to reinstitute all of the Levitical code, the Mosaic code. They think that there's two categories according to the church. There's the ceremonial law, which is things like the dietary code, and then there's the moral law, which is things like laws against murder and against homosexuality and against adultery. So they're only trying to uphold the moral law. But this was actually one of the things that that eventually helped me to see outside of our paradigm, because my grandfather would say things like that the only way for the United States to show that they have truly repented of the sin of homosexuality is for them to institute the death penalty for homosexuality, make it a capital crime. And we had a sign that said death penalty for fags. Yeah,
so the comparison to ISIS is somewhat more reasonable than I first thought. It's not that obviously you've been running around killing people, or your church has, but you're advocating a true commitment to sort of Taliban-style theocracy or ISIS-style theocracy. So what are other killing offenses? What else would you pull out of, or what else would your grandfather pull out of Leviticus as actionable?
I might say adultery, but we never. This was one of the things that let me back up 1 second. So I had okay, for one, they're not actually trying to institute a theocracy. They don't believe that the United States, they believe that the world is going to end, and that only a tiny remnant of humanity, which is to say the church itself, but only the true the elect of God. So they're not trying to actually change the laws. They're not actually trying to make anything happen with the government. They don't believe it's possible, and so it's not something that they pursue.
Right.
But that question about death penalty for fags, that was the very first point, the very first real question that I had about our theology. And when I say question, I mean doubt. The first thing I realized that we were wrong about. And it came from a conversation with a Jewish guy on Twitter. It was really, I'm advocating for the death penalty for gays, and and I'm quoting these verses from Leviticus, and he says, well, what about this member of your church who had a child out of wedlock? And I said, what about her? She repented, so she doesn't deserve that punishment. And he says, yeah, but that's also a sin worthy of death. And, and also didn't Jesus say, let he who is without sin cast the first stone? And so this is the first time, stepping back from that and realizing, if she had been killed, just if you kill someone as soon as they sin, you completely cut off the opportunity to repent and be forgiven, which is a major foundation of Christian theology. This is what we were preaching: repent or perish. You have to repent and follow God's laws and live as we live, and that's the only way to heaven. And then for him to say that, quoting Jesus, "Let he who is without sin cast the first stone," I realized, because we would always answer that quote, because people would throw that in our face all the time. We would answer that by saying, yeah, but we're not casting stones. We're preaching words. All we have are words. We put words on signs and we stand on public sidewalks. We're not hurting anybody. But we were advocating for the government to kill people. And what was Jesus talking about about there, if not the death penalty? So, I take that to, my mom and a few other people in the church, and was just immediately shut down. It's like, no, Leviticus calls for the death penalty. If that penalty was good enough for God, then it's good enough for us. Romans 1 says that gays are worthy of death, and so are their enablers. No. So
what did your mom say about the analogy to the other member of your family who had a child out of wedlock?
That I was getting wrapped around an axle. Like, oh, it's just not an important piece of theology, or that the point is they're not going to do it. That's what she said. And I remember thinking, like, well, yeah, but if we're going to use this as a litmus test, the fact that, instituting death penalty, since Jesus said, let he who is without sin cast the first stone, shouldn't the litmus test be the other direction? Shouldn't the fact that we don't do that be, showing that we're obedient to God and such? Yeah. So,
well, one thing that I think we should flag here is that it's often believed on the atheist, secularist, rationalist side of the conversation that you just can't reason people out of their heartfelt religious convictions, because there's this meme that has gone around, often attributed to someone like Mark Twain. I don't know who actually said it, but the idea is that if you can't reason somebody out of something they didn't reason themselves into, but it's clearly not true. And anyone who's actually been in dialogue with many people like yourself over the years knows it's not true. Is your effort to make your beliefs self-consistent, and this person on Twitter pointing out a logical contradiction in your beliefs was an entering wedge for you, which ultimately separated you from these ideas that had been drummed into you. So I want to get into what you now believe in a minute, but I want to linger for a moment on just what the church doctrine is. In a church like Westboro, how do you resist the move that many, many Christian denominations make, which is to disavow more or less everything in the Old Testament because it no longer applies? You don't have to fulfill the law. Jesus gave a doctrine of grace, and and none of that old barbarism applies. Why wasn't that move open to you and your family?
Because we believed that there are a lot of verses in the New Testament, a lot of passages and writers in the New Testament who reference the Old Testament as a basis and foundation for their doctrines, and sort of reinforcing them. And Jesus himself said that not one heaven and earth will pass away, but not one jot or tittle of my word will pass away until all is fulfilled.
Yeah.
So
there is that.
Yeah. We definitely didn't disavow the Old Testament. And the only reason that distinction I was explaining a minute ago about the distinction between the ceremonial law and the moral law, the reason they don't, keep kosher or something, is because of a New Testament passage that specifically sort of revises. It's in Acts 10 and 11, talks about, Peter is having a vision and, God sends this sheet down with all these animals that were unclean under the Mosaic code. And God says, "Rise, Peter, kill and eat." And Peter says, "Not so, Lord, for no unclean thing has passed my lips." And this happens 3 times. And God finally says, "Don't you call unclean what I've cleansed." So it's like, okay, this is now this, it's not no longer required to keep kosher or to follow these. And there are several other passages in the New Testament that specify which of the laws you have to follow. But so we definitely took a lot of our doctrine and a lot of our beliefs from the Old Testament.
It doesn't help that Paul also endorses the at least the morality of killing homosexuals. I think it's in Ephesians, although I think he also says that it doesn't have to be carried out. Isn't that how things shake down with Paul? I
don't know. I'm not sure about that passage you're referring to in Ephesians. But I do know we memorized Romans. We memorized a lot of the Bible, but we memorized Romans 1 one summer. And the end of Romans 1, it's basically starting from verse 18 towards the end. It's talking about gay people. And then at the end it says that, don't you know that they which commit such things are worthy of death, not only those which do the same, but have pleasure in them that do them.
That really is always the issue, that a more literalist hewing to the text has a kind of self-consistency and power, even when the text is, as the Bible is, rather amazingly inconsistent. The effort to connect the dots, the effort to make it as consistent as possible, keeps you as wedded as possible to a first century or a 1,000-year BC moral code, depending on what you're emphasizing. So it really is always the issue I'm walking into here, where the theology is really on the side of the literalist when it comes down to an argument about what the books actually say. Because any effort to make them seem merely metaphorical or more elastic than any plain reading of the text would suggest, that effort itself is clearly being driven not from some imperative that the reader is finding in the text, but an imperative that's coming from outside the text, from the world that's filled with libertines who want other things out of life. You have a different set of priorities that have come from a modern, secular, scientific, cosmopolitan commitment, and then you go back to the text trying to make sense of its sacredness, and the deck is stacked against you if you're a moderate or a liberal.
Right. I mean, I think the difference, and Graham talks about this a little bit, I think, and there's a difference. There's different kinds of belief. There's belief like my family, and I believe at least some percentage of ISIS is. And similar groups. And those are people who read the text and, like you said, the plain meaning of the text. So, and whatever they take away from that plain reading, like that is what it says and there is no interpretation. And that idea about there not being any interpretation, that's another thing that was so similar. I don't know if you read in the New Yorker, there was a story recently called Journey to Jihad. And again, with this, all these similarities. And that one was one of the first ones. It says, the leader of one of these, groups, it was called Sharia for Belgium, asked this prospective recruit if he was prepared to learn the Quran without any distortion or editing or interpretation. It's like, okay, you just read the text and it means what it means, and you have to go along with it no matter what your moral impulses would say otherwise. And then there are people who read it and there's a willingness when they read it to include their own thoughts of, like you said, things outside the text, their own beliefs and understanding of the world, that obviously influences the way that they read it, or that they're trying to, read it in light of beliefs that they already have. And my family saw that as explicitly evil. It's like, you are substituting your judgment for God's judgment when clearly the book says this. And we would quote the Bible. Like I said, we would sit around, we read the Bible every single day. We talked about world events and the church's interpretation, in the light of the church's interpretation of the Bible. And we would memorize big parts of it. And we would be standing out on the picket line, talking with people and just quoting verse after verse. And so many people, and I'm not saying everyone is like this, but so many of the people we were talking to had no idea that the Bible said these things.
Right.
I mean, and so it's a very, and again, this is one of those things. I mean, I was reading, Reza Aslan, said something like, if I were to, he was talking about you and Bill Maher, and he says, like, they believe that people derive their values from their religion. That, as every scholar of religion in the world will tell you, is false. People don't derive their values from their religion. They bring their values to their religion. And I can just say flat out, that's exactly the reverse of what happened with my family. My family, if without these, these texts, they would be doing amazing, incredible things that would change the world for the better. I mean, my family is full of lawyers and professionals, and they work hard, and they're incredibly intelligent. They have advanced degrees, and it can be incredibly kind and generous. And that's one of the things, when you're there, when you're part of it, that shows you the goodness of, like, see, so much of this stuff comes directly from the scriptures, and it's so good and so wonderful, and it's such an amazing thing to be a part of. And yet, because they have to set aside, again, their own moral impulses, and accept this, this reading of the text as they understand it, because they believe it's the word of God, they are left with, picketing funerals and, causing all sorts of trouble and heartache for people.
Yeah. Well, none of that is a surprise to me, of course. And I think the same is true even amid all the grotesque violence you see in ISIS. You see these guys. These are not depressed, suicidal psychopaths who just want to destroy their lives and go out with a bang. These are people who are deriving incredible experiences of meaning and highly energized, passionate experiences of bonding with their brothers in arms, and they just have no doubt that what they're doing is morally right, and that the creator of the universe is going to reward them for doing it. And so it's not to hear that your family was experiencing and probably still is experiencing a rich life in the context of these beliefs doesn't surprise me at all. What is it about? Explain the picketing of funerals, in particular the funerals of soldiers. What is that about, and what does the sign "Thank God for Dead Soldiers" mean?
Soldiers' funerals. The picketing started in June of 2005. So it was a couple years into the war, and they were seeing that my grandfather called the funerals that we would see on television. They're not funerals, they're patriotic pep rallies, and encouraging people in their sins when clearly God has not blessed this family. God has cursed them. There's all sorts of verses in the Old Testament in the book of Judges, says, they chose new gods, then was war in their gates. And then in the books of the Kings, it says, for there fell down many slain because the war was of God. And then in the book of Hosea, it says, they have deeply corrupted themselves. Therefore, I will remember their iniquity and I will visit their sins. Though they bring up their children, yet will I bereave them, that there shall not be a man left. So all these things that connect, idolatry and sin with punishment, and specifically killing soldiers in battle. And so we thought that it was our duty to go to these funerals and to show people, to explain this connection between the sin and the punishment. And for us, it was a direct connection, an undeniable connection. And so that's what we were doing.
So it wasn't a protest against any one of our wars. It was not that you were protesting U.S. foreign policy. It's just you were drawing the connection between God's omnipotence and this outcome. And obviously, if God had wanted to protect these soldiers, he would have.
Right. And we were saying not only was he not just not protecting them, he was deliberately killing them because of the sins of America and of the specific families. Before we would go to a funeral, we would read, whoever was on that trip would read all the articles we could find in the newspapers about the soldier, the obituary and whatever else, other stories that were written about them, and identify the sins of this specific soldier. So most of them were not gay, of course, but they were, talking about the soldier's pregnant girlfriend, or when they were celebrating Christmas or Halloween or otherwise, showing that they were not obedient to the scriptures as we understood them.
But now, why not do this for just ordinary deaths? There's a bus accident and a bunch of people die.
Oh, they do.
Oh, they do. So
the Charleston shootings is one of the things recently that they've been talking about doing, about protesting. I'm not sure if they actually are going to, because we would always proclaim that we would be picketing them, but we didn't actually always go. Right. And that was only because of lack of opportunity.
Well, if your grandfather wants attention, I would say he's going to get it doing that. That's pretty remarkable. So yeah, so the picketing of the soldiers' funerals, just to be clear, the sin of the country you were protesting in that case doesn't have anything to do with U.S. foreign policy or our misadventures in the Middle East. You're just pointing out the fact that a country that tolerates sinfulness like homosexuality can expect to pay this price when its soldiers come back in body bags.
Precisely. Exactly.
I'm sorry, I interrupted you. Did you have more on that?
Well, you just asked about that specific sign, the Thank God for Dead Soldiers sign. Mm-hmm. And then we had several others, like Thank God for AIDS, and things like that. So you're supposed to thank God, we would say, for all of his judgments, because they're all righteous. So even when you don't like them or when they're painful or hurtful to you, you have to acknowledge that God is sovereign and that everything he does is good and right. And that, and you should take this, dead soldier, this dead child, as a warning. So you're not dead yet. Like, God didn't kill you. You still have an opportunity to repent. So, and not only not an opportunity, but an obligation to repent. So that's why, thank God for dead soldiers.
So now, how old were you when you were actively a part of this, in the sense that you're picketing funerals and you're expressing your beliefs in public? This is throughout your teenage years and into your early 20s, or?
Right. So I left about 2.5 years ago when I was almost 27. Like I said, the picketing started when I was 5, and we picketed every single day in Topeka. And of course, like I said, also every day we were reading the Bible and memorizing and talking about it. And so all through school, this is...
After school, you're picketing? Were you homeschooled, or you were going to a public school? Or
public school, yeah. And so, of course, all of our classmates knew exactly who we were and what we believed. And in fact, in high school, we would be in class, sitting in class with our, the people, our classmates, and lunchtime would come, and we'd, cross the parking lot, cross the street, and pick up a sign and picket our high school during lunch.
Oh man! So now, what was that experience like, being a child more or less being obliged to express those beliefs in a social context of other children in a school who obviously didn't share those beliefs to any significant degree. Socially, what was that like for you?
I think we were kind of a conundrum for a lot of people, because our parents taught us to be kind and friendly and helpful and polite, which we were, because and then of course we would be doing all these things that people think are disgusting and hurtful and not true, and saying all these things. So I think we were a conundrum for people because they would expect people with our sorts of beliefs to be horrible people. And for us, it was so important that people only hate us for our beliefs. It was so important that our behavior and that we were above reproach. So, and this carried over into even our schooling. Education was super important. And, if we weren't getting a 4.0 GPA, there better be a good reason why. So, of course, a lot of us did.
So did you form close friendships with people who were outside your church? And what was that like?
Not very close, because we were always really suspicious of people outside the church. And of course, this is something that was drummed into us all our lives. These people hate each other, we would say. And they certainly hate us. They don't care about you. They don't care about each other. All they want to do is live how they want to live and encourage one another in their sins. And you can't trust them. So I definitely wouldn't, of course we'd talk about, music or books or homework.
So this is from age 5 on, you're not forming friendships with other 5-year-olds, and you had an in-group, out-group view of yourself from your earliest memories. Is that the case?
Absolutely. Absolutely. And the way that you just put that the identity aspect of it, and especially for those of us who grew up there, it's so strong, us versus them. There is no middle ground. That was something, again, that was also drummed into us. There's no, that you're either a Jacob or an Esau. I don't know if you know the Bible that much, but they were twins in the scriptures, and God loved Jacob and hated Esau. It says before they were even born, God loved Jacob and hated Esau. And so you're either a Jacob or an Esau. And if you are a Jacob, you want nothing to do with the world. Jesus, the book of James talks about friendship with the world is enmity with God, and how you're not supposed to love not the world, neither the things that are in the world. And so it was very important to have this us, them. And of course, when you're standing on a picket line every day and people are driving by, screaming at you and honking and throwing things, and we're traveling this whole time too. This was not just happening in Topeka. We were traveling across the country regularly, and that definitely solidifies this identity. And it's really crazy. There was this article a few months ago in the New York Times called "The Brain's Empathy Gap," and it was talking about how the suppression of empathy is most strongly correlated with group identity. So it's not people who are just inherently more empathetic, like that they display the most empathy. But when you're in these groups, that's the most important thing. And the stronger your group identity, the more you're able to suppress empathy for the out group.
Yeah.
So that's definitely the case, I think, for us.
Yeah, and as you point out, it is a self-fulfilling prophecy. If you have a sufficiently insular set of beliefs that are divisive and attract into you the consternation of the outgroup, well then, of course, those collisions with the outgroup will seem to justify everything you have been believing about them. I mean, you see that in every cult, essentially. And so do you now think about your upbringing as being one in which you were brought up in a cult and have now escaped the cult? Does that seem fair?
I generally avoid the word cult just because it just seems unnecessarily, I don't know, not provocative exactly, but I think that I do think now that there's a lot of, the indoctrination, the fact that in our church, it's all or nothing. There can be no, difference of opinion or, even no matter how slight in matters of conscience. And the fact that, and the threat, this was, I read in that Journey to Jihad, it said something about the threat of excommunication kept most members obedient. When you're in a group like that, where your whole life is tied up in it. So yes, we went to public school. Yes, they have jobs outside the church. A lot of them have jobs outside the church, but there was always this otherness about us and the way we saw ourselves in the world. For me, it was, it's my family, my church, my home, my job, my entire life is wrapped up in that. And so for me to, go to my mom or go to my family members when I had that first question and doubt, and to be shut down like that, what I did for a while was just suppress it. It's like, okay, I either have to lose everything or go along with this thing that I don't believe. So, I stopped holding the sign. That was the way I sort of reconciled it. But then I just, you just go on. That pressure, they see that as perfectly scriptural. That's, we're just following what the Bible says. We can't have, there's a lot of verses in the New Testament that talk about how the church has to be of one mind, of one accord, in one place, of the same judgment. So therefore, we have to agree on everything. And so to have that kind of pressure, it makes it so it's definitely cult-like. To answer your question, sorry.
Is the church winning new converts, or is it just a stable group of people?
It was mostly stable. There was in 2001 there was a family of 4 who joined the church. It was there was a documentary filmmaker who was living in Florida, who as he's making the documentary, at first to try to prove that we were wrong and that the Bible didn't really say these things, he was like, wait, it does say this stuff. And eventually he converted and moved his family, him and his wife and their 2 kids.
Did they make the documentary? Was that the actual subject of the documentary?
It was, yeah.
His conversion is detailed in the documentary?
No, I'm sorry. His conversion isn't. It turned into, it was originally called Fred the Movie, and now it's called Hate Muggers. It's more of this, how the church came to be and what they were doing and why.
But now this person is in the church?
Yes, he's actually one of the elders now, one of the pastors.
Oh, that is hilarious.
And then there was really no new converts until 2011. And during 2011, there was, 10 or 12 people who joined the church, including some like younger people, like my age, and they're in their 20s. And like, I was like, oh my God, the world is going to end because it was this crazy, we'd never experienced something like that before. Many of them eventually left again. And then since my sister and I left 2.5 years ago, there's been a few more people who have joined. So
how big is it now? How many people are in it?
Between 70 and 80 or so.
So yeah, I'd like to find out a little bit more about what you believed growing up. Clearly, you were quite concerned about winding up in hell. You must have thought all of the other people who you went to school with and who you were meeting and liking to whatever degree were going to go to hell unless they came completely over to your side of things theologically, right? What's the experience of a child with that worldview? Are you because you must be forming some kind of attachments with other children, but you also believe that they and their parents and their brothers and sisters are going to burn in hell for eternity. Did that bother you, or is it enough of an abstraction that you don't really think about it?
No. So it was strange because you'd meet people and you'd like them, and sometimes they'd be really kind to you and friendly, and you could have, fun playing on the playground or talking about, like I was saying, books and music and stuff. But and then there was a common question that would come up as you develop these friendships. Eventually, a lot of times, it would come to, yeah, but you think I'm going to hell. Mm. And of course, you're obliged to say, well, yeah, but, I like you, kind of. And that's why we're picketing. That we thought that by picketing, that we saw this as the definition of love. So when love thy neighbor first comes up in the Bible, it's in Leviticus 19, verses 17 and 18. And it says, thou shalt not hate thy neighbor in thine heart, but thou shalt in any wise rebuke him and not suffer a sin upon him. It says, thou shalt not avenge nor bear any grudge against the children of thy people, but thou shalt love thy neighbor as thyself. So to hate your neighbor in your heart is to not rebuke him when you see him sinning. So we thought we were fulfilling this commandment to love our neighbor by going out and warning people of the consequences of their sins. So as much as the word hate appears on all the signs, it's always the hatred of God. So there's this kind of strange dichotomy, I guess, between what people believed about us and what we believed and what we actually believed and how we felt about people.
Yeah. Yeah. Well, it reminds me, there was a moment somewhat widely reported when members of ISIS were executing, I believe, men claimed to be guilty of homosexuality. And there were these, as you imagine, the whole thing is horrible, but what made it especially so was that there were these apparently tender moments between the jihadists who were about to execute their neighbors for the sin of homosexuality, where they would hug them and they were expressing what to any disinterested observer looks like ordinary compassion, and then went on to throw these people from a rooftop or topple a wall on them or stone them. I forget how they actually killed them, but you had this mismatch between, from a secular perspective, a completely insane level of bigotry and intolerance, and yet it was clearly framed in their mind as not being synonymous with interpersonal hatred. It was a kind of compassion. They are executing God's law, and they are hating the sin and not the sinner on some level, and that. It proved impossible for many people to interpret who don't actually have enough empathy to put themselves in the shoes of people who actually believe these things. But what I'm hearing from you on this topic is reminding me of that. Does that seem like a good analogy?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, I read that too, and I knew exactly what that feeling was like. I mean, obviously not killing somebody, but it's that apparent mismatch that you describe. And I could absolutely, and it's almost mind-boggling, even for me now, to read accounts like that. And so you just are kind of aghast at it. But I also realize that even though I know that mindset, I know what that's like, it's still baffling to me now. And so I think, the fact that my family really believes all these things, that I'm first coming to understand what hell is and why I got baptized, and the incredible amount of fear and motivation that comes from those beliefs, and why we would do such, to outsiders seems like such extreme things, but they made perfect sense at the time. So I understand that if this is baffling and not baffling might not quite be the right word, but to me, then what must it be like for people who have never been in that position? And I can totally understand why so many people want to deny a connection between, Islam and ISIS, or between Christianity and Westboro. And I understand it, but it's not accurate. It's not, it just misses the whole point.
Yeah, and it also ignores the fact that there is no clear line between what should be so hard to believe that you can't actually believe anyone believes it, and beliefs that, of course, are believed and are actually the engines of emotion and behavior. Because one man's crazy claim is another man's rather straightforward statement of theology, and it's. Where does something become so strange that you need to doubt that anyone believes it, that people can believe? The truth is, there are scientific propositions that are as strange as anything in theology. It's just we believe them because we have arrived at them by very different methods. Quantum mechanics is incredibly strange, and the idea, just the knowledge of the the size of the universe and its age, and any specific process in the world that is deeply counterintuitive, from the germ theory of disease to the way DNA regulates reproduction. I mean, all of this stuff, we don't have intuitions that marry well to most of what goes on in the world in any detail. And the truth is that the religious stories of divine justice and the bad people getting what they really deserve after death, these do marry to our intuitions better than many things in science. And that's why so many millions of people hold to these ideas generation after generation. So it's always seemed to me that this incredulity over others' credulity just seems like it's never fully thought through. And especially when you look at what it takes to indoctrinate a child into any system of beliefs. I have two young daughters who more or less believe whatever is told to them. What's their choice? My youngest doesn't believe much of anything because she's just beginning to speak. But my 6-year-old, now she's obviously capable of questioning claims you make about the nature of the world, and she's trying to put two and two together. But it's absolutely clear that if from the moment of her birth I had told her that there was nothing more important than staying out of hell, and that this book is the recipe guide for a moral life and was dictated by the creator of the universe, beliefs that I imagine are more or less what were handed to you, of course you're going to grow up believing these things without question until some genius on Twitter forces you to look at a contradiction within your own belief system.
Right, and especially when, like, for me and my siblings in my family, we were taught all those things you just mentioned, but we were also taught how to interpret evidence, how to see everything in the world, and to have every objection that might ever arise and have the answer to that objection already, having repeated it over and over again. It makes it so that it's such an almost impossible, once you accept the premises, it's almost impossible to argue yourself out of that paradigm until, like you said, some sort of internal inconsistency.
Yeah, I mean, that's the really diabolical nature of this kind of belief system, because it is hermetically sealed. All arguments from the outside have been pre-stigmatized, and I mean, you can just use the blanket formula of saying that all of your doubts and all of the intrusions of reason are just the temptations of Satan, right? Is that something that was ever explicitly said in your church?
Absolutely. If you have a doubt or a question about these standards, which are so clearly laid out in Scripture, then you're doubting not just Scripture, but God Himself, and questioning God Himself, and trying to, again, substitute your judgment for God's. And how dare you? How dare you? That was always who the hell are you, little kid, to question? Or, I mean, I'm not just talking about little kids, but when you're hearing that as you grow up, you have no confidence in your own thoughts and your own thinking, because this is all. You have to set aside everything that you think and feel, everything that you see, and see it this way. Impose this ideology on top of everything else, because it is paramount over and above everything else.
So when were your first doubts kindled? Was it this Twitter exchange, or did something happen earlier? I mean,
after I first thought of leaving. So that conversation on Twitter was in November of 2010. I first thought of leaving July of 2012, after a lot of other things happened in the church. But once it actually occurred to me that I might have to leave, suddenly it was like my entire worldview was just completely up in the air. I wasn't sure about anything. I had no idea. And suddenly every doubt and question that I'd ever had, but had neglected to pursue, if you know what I mean. So I remember being in college, and I took a logic class that I loved. I loved logic. And I'm like driving to school one day, and I'm thinking through all these, some of these arguments, or something that had happened, and so theological arguments, and realizing that there was literally no evidence that could be introduced to us to change our opinions. There was no evidence that if somebody says that, that they love us, that they care about us, well, they're just either lying or delusional. And, and then if they say they hate us, of course they hate us. So everybody hates us. So there's no way of getting out of these, preconceived notions that we already had. And I remember being kind of bothered by that. And then I arrived at school and I was like, huh. And then just went on yeah, that's totally normal. And several other things like hell. I remember, so our concept of hell and heaven, hell is you spend eternity there, and it's, the worm that eats on you never dies, and the fire is never quenched, and the smoke of their torment ascendeth up forever and ever, and they have no rest day nor night, and etc. So this is hell. The hottest places in hell are reserved for ex-members of Westboro Baptist Church, because we knew the truth and had rejected it. Right. So the more knowledge you have, the worse the pain is in hell. And the only thing that changes in hell is your ability to feel pain. So as your ability to feel pain is completely, filled up, then that ability increases. And as that ability to feel pain increases, so too does the pain itself.
Oh, God really is merciful, isn't he? Wow. Just when you were worried that you were going to run out of your ability to feel pain, he gives you more of it.
Right, exactly. And then our concept of a heaven was that we got to judge the people in hell. So we each in heaven, all of the saints of God and his elect, would be in heaven and have a caseload where every wrong thought and deed that any and every person had ever committed, they were all going to be adjudicated. And so this was going to be our lot in heaven. And I remember listening to Gramps talk about this in church one day when I think maybe in my early 20s, and several times actually, but just suddenly it occurring to me, I can't even watch like a torture scene in a movie or something, like without getting absolutely enraged and just so disgusted and horrified, and like, well, maybe by the time I get to heaven, like I'll see this as a good thing. Like there's something wrong with me for being disgusted at torture, right? Right. And so these are things that are all occurring to me after it occurs to me to leave.
You'll grow a thicker skin in heaven.
Yeah, right. Yeah. I mean, and it's just so many things suddenly, once it wasn't, once you think about losing everything, your family and your whole life and everything, then suddenly, it's, you have to think through everything. Is this right? Is this actually the truth? Or, have I been indoctrinated? Are we wrong about these things?
So now, are you having open discussions with the rest of your family members at this point, or is it all going on privately and you're just stewing, trying to figure out what to do with your doubts?
Mostly the latter. I waited less than a day after it first occurred to me. First, I thought, oh my God, as soon as I thought of it, oh my God, I have to leave immediately, because just the fact that it occurred to me to leave means that I don't belong here, and that I'm a betrayer. I felt so horribly guilty and evil, and like I was already condemned. And so, but I was with my sister Grace at the time, who's 7 years younger than me. There's 11 kids in our family, and I'm the third oldest. She's the seventh. But we were really good friends, and we had been talking about some things that had changed, that were changing within the church over the past, little over a year. And so when it first occurred to me and I thought I have to leave immediately, I saw her and I was like, I can't leave without talking to her. So I did talk to her the next day, and it was terrifying because she could have, I didn't know for sure if she wouldn't tell on me. And if she told on me, what would happen? Like, I either would have been gone, immediately, or else, put under, I want to say heavy surveillance, but like, it's the sort of thing where they take your phone away, they take your computer away. You'd have to, I don't know, be doing like manual labor and stuff. Like, somebody is always going to be having their eye on you if you want to stay.
Were you worried that you could be physically harmed by your family, or was it not that kind of family?
No. Yeah, not that kind of family. It's not the physical. It's nothing worldly exactly. I mean, except I guess your home and, all of your stuff and everything. But, I mean, my parents like helped us when we actually finally did leave. They helped us pack our things. And so, I mean, it wasn't a physical thing. No, it was just the prospect of being excommunicated or leaving ourselves. We would just lose everything. So it was Grace, my sister, was the only person who I could talk with openly about these things.
And you knew that because you just knew how strong everyone else's commitment was, or you made some attempt and ran into a brick wall with others? Both.
And especially, so like I said, it was in early July when I first thought of leaving, and we left in mid-November of 2012. And so during that time, the more time went on, the more open I was with others about my questions and doubts, because I thought we were wrong about so many things, and I thought I have to try. We didn't want to leave. We wanted the church to be right. We wanted them to, we felt like it had gone way off track, and there were so many things that were wrong, and we just wanted to fix it. We wanted to stay. And there was just we realized, because after hitting brick wall after brick wall after brick wall, there wasn't anything else we could do from the inside, and we couldn't go on doing these things that we had come to believe were wrong.
So how would you summarize your beliefs and worldview now? What have you left Westboro with at this point?
Well, I'm still keenly interested in theology, and I spend a lot of time thinking and writing about it partly because, one, I still follow my family on Twitter. They blocked us on our main Twitter accounts, but I have a separate Twitter account where we only follow them. Mm-hmm. And so I'm seeing these same ideas that we have, now rejected, and looking for less harmful ways of interpreting it, partly because of another, reference to Graham's article. At the end of the article, he was talking about dissuasion, and how giving people with these extreme beliefs an off-ramp so that it's not the beliefs themselves aren't as harmful to themselves or to other people. So I spent a lot of time thinking and reading the Bible, and but I definitely struggle with belief of any kind, because it seems like you always come to a place where you have to set aside logic and reason and the impact of beliefs, and just say, okay, well, we don't know about this. We don't know how to interpret it, but God is good, and you just have to go along with it. Mm. And I'm just not willing to do that anymore, because I did that for almost 27 years, and I think that was not a good thing to do, not a good way of approaching the world. And I would echo John Ronson, who wrote that book, So You've Been Publicly Shamed.
Yeah.
He said, certainly I believe that human beings are more important than ideology. And I definitely believe that.
So the off-ramp for you, was it mostly logical, or was it mostly moral? Which is to say, were you troubled most by the sudden exposure of inconsistency, or were you troubled by the fact that you felt that the behavior of your church was causing unnecessary suffering for others, or was it just equal parts?
And it started out definitely more logical, but then also, the Jewish guy, that first point, I think that was really important, because then when things came up later, for the first time in my life, I was really willing to say, I think I'm right about this, and the elders are wrong. Which, of course, my family would now see as an inexcusable arrogance for me to say something like that. But nevertheless, so a lot of things within the church started to change too, that revealed a lot more inconsistency. So it started out being logical, and then when it became so clear, I mean, in my mind, that we were doing things and believing things that were unscriptural, then everything sort of, like I was saying, my faith was shaken to its foundations, because it's like, well, wait a second then, like, why the Bible? Why not the Quran? Why not? And then, of course, I eventually get to the place where I was reading in your letter to a Christian nation. You finally, I've been struggling with how to phrase this, but you said it perfectly about how we as believers were using our own moral impulses to authenticate the moral truth of the Bible, and yet saying that other people could not rely on their own moral impulses. And, for me, there's this verse in Jeremiah that, I remember my mom, reading it to us when I was really little, and just, it was so, so important for us to understand this. She quoted this verse that said, for the heart is deceitful above all things and desperately wicked, and who can know it? And this was an injunction for us. Like, you can't rely on your own thoughts. You have to accept this interpretation of the Bible, and everything else is wrong. So, realizing that it was still us, like, to even say the Bible says this, that's still us. It's still our thoughts. It's still our interpretation. It's still our, and how can we rely? It's a paradox, right? So how can we be relying on our hearts when our hearts are evil, right?
Right.
So anyways, it was very confusing and horrible, and an awful, awful time. Those months before we left, they were even harder, I think, than the months after we left.
Yeah. Are you still in touch with your mom or anyone else in your family, or has that been broken off entirely?
No, it's broken off entirely, but not on our side. Like, we don't want that, and we still want to and try to reach out to them. But to them, we are not only the most evil of the most evil, because we knew the truth and then denied it and walked away. And, in their eyes, we have crucified to ourselves the Son of God afresh and put him to an open shame. That's the verse that talks about us. But so in addition to being the most evil of the most evil, we are the most dangerous to them, because they have some kind of, love and care for us. And so they can't. Jesus said, who is my mother and who are my brethren? It's these that do the will of God. So to them, we're not even their family anymore.
So I guess I formed too rosy a picture of your exit, because you told me that your mother was helping you pack your bags. And so I was picturing it being less acrimonious than that. So was there stark and painful conflict at the exit, or were they just resigned to you leaving and now want nothing more to do with you? I
think they were resigned. I mean, like, several people came and, the day that we left and tried to talk us out of it. I was very entrenched, I guess you could say, in the church. I loved it there for so long. I was so happy. I really believed that we were doing what God required of us. And there's such a sense of, identity and belonging and truth and meaning and purpose and safety and reward, all these things. And I felt valued and treasured and loved and cared for, not just by God, but by the members in the church. And because I was so zealous, it was even I was this sort of, I felt like this, cherished daughter and so for me, and because I was so outspoken for the church, I mean, like, a year before I left, there was this big article in the Kansas City Star kind of contrasting me and a cousin of mine who was about my age who left a few years before then. And, and the article ends with me saying, I'm all in. And I was, but Anyway, so much changed. But anyway, so it was this horrible, wrenching, gut-wrenching, heart-wrenching thing to leave, and to be faced with all these people that I loved so much, and I still love so much, and to know that, they couldn't say anything that would satisfy me, that would be able to make me stay, and there was nothing that I could say, it seemed, at least not at that point, to convince them that there was another way,
Yeah, it's really tragic and fascinating if you're sitting in my seat. I'm obviously very sorry you went through it, but you clearly have been equipped as a result of this experience with tools that very few people have. I really think you will help a lot of people if you keep speaking and reasoning in public, because you have a unique experience, and you're extremely well-spoken, and you're just a very cool woman who I think can do a lot of good. So it's, there is a silver lining to this, but I have no doubt it was really painful to go through, and surely still is.
Definitely. And yeah, I mean, then that thing that you just said about helping people, ironically to some people, of course, it makes perfect sense to me, but that desire, I have no doubt, comes in major part from my upbringing. I mean, we were really trying to do good and to be good, and I still really want to do that. And so that's why I've been, doing these talks sometimes with, sometimes interfaith groups, and at universities, and a lot of other places. But I actually ended up, this is really funny, that guy from Twitter, he was running this Jewish cultural festival in Long Beach, and I had picketed it in 2009, and just 3 or 4 months or so after my sister and I left, we ended up at that festival speaking about it for the first time.
Oh, great.
So that was really and I was staying in the home of the rabbi. Like 3 years before, my sister had held a sign that said, "Your rabbi is a whore," and now we're staying at him, this Hasidic rabbi, and his wife and their 4 kids, and
nice.
They're just welcoming us with open arms, and just incredibly kind and helpful, and and willing to talk about theology and all these. Just, we've met so many wonderful people like that, and it's been an amazing journey, I guess.
Nice.
I'm really thankful.
Yeah, well, I'm thankful you got out, and I'm very grateful you took the time to speak with me. But where can people find out more about you? What's your Twitter handle and any other information you want out there?
My Twitter handle is Megan Phelps, MEGAN PHELPS. And my sister and I have a blog that we almost never post. It's called Gypsies and Sinners, and it's on WordPress, gypsiesandsInners.wordpress.com.
Great. Well, I encourage people to follow you, because you're very interesting and seemingly grounded in ways that very few people are. I have only met you for 90 minutes, but I admire you, and I wish you the best of luck, Megan.
Thanks so much, Sam.
If you enjoyed this podcast, there are several ways you can support it. You can leave reviews on iTunes or Stitcher or wherever you happen to listen to it. You can share it on social media with your friends. You can discuss it on your own blog or podcast. Or you can support